Hi, everybody. My name is Ember Kelly, and I am the Director of Religious Education at the Fourth Universalist Society in the city of New York. It is wonderful to be here with you all, both on Facebook and on Zoom. And in the future, if anybody is watching this on YouTube, it's good to be with you on YouTube in the future time as well. Let us know how the future is. So we are really excited for tonight. I'm really excited for this conversation. We had a great podcast conversation with myself and Matt and Dean. I'm going to both link the podcast as well as the link to their podcast website, so you can check those out in the future if you get a chance to. But so this month is about critical thinking. How do we, in a world with, fake news is this, big theme of the year, whether it's Trump talking about it or the news being fake as we deal with so much on social media. How do we be critical, whether we're thinking about like sacred texts that we're reading, whether we're thinking about news report that we're reading? How do we be critical and think critically about that? And so I was really excited that I got to have the amazing and wonderful hosts of the Magnificast, Dean and Matt, come with and join us for both a podcast and this In Conversation event. So it's just really great to have you both on board for this event.
Yeah, thanks for having us. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, really nice to be with you again, Ember.
Yes. So let's start, with the first question, which should be nice and simple. And as I mentioned, as some folks were coming in, we will have time for questions from the general audience at the end. And I will also try and swing by the Facebook to see if there's questions on there as well. So we have both options, but if you have questions, feel free to maybe leave them in the chat box, but it might also just help to leave them till the end so that they don't get lost in the chat box. So our first question for our wonderful host is, could you tell us a little bit about yourselves and how the Magnificast came to be?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and start briefly about myself anyway. I'm Roman Catholic. I'm from the United States, but I've lived here in Toronto in Canada for nearly 10 years. I write as a journalist for a number of publications, and I do some work in socialism and trying to organize around those sorts of issues here in Toronto. The podcast is the Magnificast that Matt and I started shortly after Donald Trump became president. It kind of was an excuse for us to hang out and spend some time together. But over the last few years, it has sort of blossomed into this really neat project that we do once a week. We talk about religion, specifically Christianity, and left-wing politics, especially. So we talk to journalists and academics, activists, all kinds of folks, just to get some different angles on that conversation each week. Matt, you want to fill that in a bit more?
Yeah, for sure. I'm Matt Bernico. I'm the other half of the podcast. Let's see. I used to be an academic. I rushed to get my PhD right after my undergrad and did all of that, and it was a great time. But since then, I've left academia altogether, and I work in the labor movement now. Yeah, working hard. Oh, I live in St. Louis. I should probably mention that. So I'm in the Midwest, trying to start unions and help working people do their thing. But yeah, just like Dean said, we met online. We had a mutual interest, I think, in the ways that socialism, but just like all kinds of like social justice topics end up kind of merging into our Christian thinking. So yeah, we just kind of struck up a friendship and started a podcast together. I think it was really important for us to something that Dean and I talk about a lot on our podcast is like, when we read history, we read about Christians who are like way outside the norm of like regular sort of like white evangelical belief. And when we find those Christians who are socialists, who are anarchists, who are, just people really invested in social democracy, we felt like that was giving us like permission to be different types of religious people, and kind of break out of the molds that maybe we held on to at first. So yeah, we thought it was a good idea to maybe create a platform around that idea to give other people who identify as Christian like permission to be different types of religious people and explore different sorts of expressions of faith and politics.
So speaking of breaking out of the mold, I believe that all three of us share a similar upbringing mold in terms of relationship to evangelical Christianity. Do you want to maybe touch on that a little bit in terms of how that's impacted you?
Yeah, for sure. Yep, Dean's story is a little bit more complicated than mine, but I grew up in a really conservative evangelical house, and when I started getting older and I was asking the big questions about the world that I think everyone comes to ask sooner or later, everyone in my life, they kept telling me, yeah, well, you just got to read the Bible. You just got to read the Bible and you'll learn all of the things there are to know. And that's what you do. And I did what they told me to. I read the Bible, and I think I probably found some things they would have rather me not have found. I found a God who asked their followers to protect the poor and tear the mighty down from their thrones. I found a God who tells you to stand up for the to feed the hungry, to free the prisoners. Probably not the things that all of the very conservative evangelicals in my life would have had me want. Yeah, so I kind of come out of that background. Evangelicals made me, and then they made me into the monster that I am now. So all around, they created me, and that's that's all I have to say about that, I guess.
Yeah, I grew up Roman Catholic. I went to Catholic school as a kid, but all my friends as a young person happened to be evangelical. So my adolescence was spent in that same kind of space. And Matt and I have a really a strangely echoing sort of experience in that respect. So I came into the evangelical fold later, and thankfully, I think, I didn't have the same kind of family pressures a lot of evangelicals do, but in my social circles, I bought it, right? You should read the Bible and create as short a line as possible from what the Bible says to what you should be doing in your life. And the Bible's a complicated book, of course. It's not so simple that it's always radical all the time or anything, but because it's so complicated, it's also not as simple as what a lot of conservative evangelicals tended to make it out to be. So, at a certain point, you can only handle so much tension in your brain, and I guess it snapped at some point, and I found myself back out of evangelicalism. But I'm not too bitter about it. It is what it is. But I found my way back to Catholicism mostly because of things like liberation theology and finding my own way back into this tradition that I happen to be raised in. So that's anyway, the evangelical connection is very formative in my life, and I know a lot of Bible verses as a result of it. So I'm grateful for that part of it, at least. Good consolation prize.
Hey, got to say thanks for all that Bible memorization we had to do as kids. And so how long has the podcast been going for?
We just a few weeks ago did our 200th episode, so we've been doing it for, I guess, 2 years. Yeah, pretty long running niche podcast.
Yeah, quite the run. I'm only on like 12 episodes of our church's podcast, so I'm hoping to get there to 200 someday. So we've all been told, Marx said, religion is the opiate of the masses. So socialism, leftism, and Christianity, how do you mix together these, what seem like very different ideas?
Sorry, Dean, I thought you were going to answer that one.
I was trying to, but I couldn't. Sure. Yeah, for some reason my Zoom wouldn't unmute, but I've got it. That Marx quote, that religion is the opium of the masses. Of course, that's the one thing that everybody hears and remembers from Marx, whether you're a Marxist or not. I think somebody hears that at some point. I'd say, first of all, Marx is an atheist, and that's fine, right? I have a lot of friends who are atheists, and we get along okay. I don't know whether Marx would have liked me or not, but I'm kind of not too bothered by that speculative exercise. I will say that quote is more complicated than it's often sort of caricatured as. It comes from a longer passage where Marx says that religious suffering is the expression of real suffering and also a protest against real suffering, he says, and goes on to say that it's the sigh of the oppressed creature. So it is the opium of the masses for Marx, but it's more like it's kind of like the beer that you have at the end of the day to like help you get through how crappy your day is and how difficult your life is, right? And in that sense, Marx isn't that wrong, right? For a lot of people, that is what religion is, and it's fine. Like it's just a a thing that helps you get through the difficulties of life, but it can often blind you from the realities that are right in front of you. And in that sense, I get a lot of inspiration even from Marx's particular kind of atheism. I think reconciling these forms of politics, Marxism and Christian living, for me, it comes down to taking cues from people who have already done it successfully, right? I think there's this temptation to think that you have to create a whole new worldview out of whole cloth or something like that. But there are so many people historically who have found themselves working together, Christians and Marxists alongside each other, in really dire situations and to great effect, to really wonderful causes in places like Nicaragua or today in parts of Cuba and things like that. So I'm really encouraged by the fact that these forms of solidarity happen on the ground, whatever kinds of contradictions there might be in terms of people's belief systems. I'll stop there. Matt, what else can we throw onto that pile?
Yeah, I think that's right. For Marx, that quote, what he means is that religion has like a social function, right? And the sort of classical, I think Marx's criticism is that religion is something that kind of subdues the working class, or like you said, like just helps them get by, I guess, cope with a bad situation they might be in. And I don't know, there is probably some truth to that. And I think that's how it could be construed. And I don't know, Marx probably isn't wrong. But at the same time, there's all kinds of other people throughout history, like Dean mentioned, that found religion exactly the opposite. Instead of it being the thing that sort of just helps you cope, it's a thing that motivates people to, I don't know, do some pretty radical stuff. I always think about Camilo Torres, who is a priest in Colombia. He was studying sociology and kind of trying to get to the bottom of what the, what's the root of oppression in their country. And in the end, his sociological findings, but also the sort of religious fervor behind his Christian understanding of the world, ended up forcing him to pick up arms and fight against the forces that be, the Colombian government at the time. So he ended up being a guerrilla, priest to guerrilla fighter. And I think that's I'm not ready to do that, but I think that's a really interesting type of story that tells a sort of a counter narrative to the usual things that you hear about religion and how it makes people complacent or just kind of accept the place they are in the world, right? There are all these other Christians throughout Latin America, but throughout other so-called third world countries or whatever, who've done just the same thing. They find that their faith motivates them to do things like fight for the poor. And I think that's pretty wild. And I guess part of what I really like about our podcast and learning about this sort of realm of things.
Well, motivate, that seems like a perfect lead into my next question for you, which is, what really motivates you guys, both in the work of this podcast, but in your other radical work and just your work in life in general? It sounds like you've made a whole switch from academia to a more on the ground approach. What motivates you in all this? And, does it feel particularly urgent right in this moment, especially this year was, just such an absurd year? What pushes you?
Go ahead, Matt.
All right. Yeah, I think that I think the way that I understand my religious convictions and commitments, I think that does a lot of motivating for me. I think that social justice, kind of whatever it looks like in whatever sort of space, is kind of an imperative of the gospel and of Christian life. I think it's just something that is there. A lot of people, I don't know, when it comes to social justice and working for people and with people, doing political work, people use the gospel passage Matthew 25, where Jesus tells his followers that whenever they help people in need, they're feeding the hungry, they're freeing the prisoners, they're clothing the naked, et cetera, they're always helping Jesus, right? That's that's where you encounter Jesus, because Jesus, the Christian God, identifies directly with the poor. And that is a really motivating idea for me, that's where you find God, is among the people who are poor and oppressed and struggling. So that's, like I said, that's a really motivating idea for me. I think when I mentioned in the beginning of this, I work in the labor movement, and I guess you see the face of God in people. You see people struggling just to pay their bills and to buy groceries, and they make Well, in my state, $9.45 an hour, but in other states, $7. Not very much less than that. The minimum wage is so low, people are struggling to get by. They can't form unions. They don't get paid sick time. You see all of these people, and like these are the people Jesus was talking about. They're the people who you need that we're called to help, right? We could talk more about that, I guess, in a minute, but I don't want to monopolize the situation. Dean, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny that you brought up Matthew 25 because Matt and I didn't talk beforehand, but that was the passage that I had been thinking about as well. I think because, in the Catholic Church, even though it's difficult to be attending church and all that kind of thing right now, the liturgical season is nevertheless still a kind of grounding thing. And in the Catholic Church and many other Christian churches too, of course, it's the Advent season, which we typically look at as preparing ourselves for the incarnation, the nativity scene, right, coming to Christmas time. But it's also an anticipation for the second coming, which is the Judgment Day, right? And I think a lot of Christians look at Judgment Day as this kind of tallying up of, were you a good person or a bad person? Did you tell a bunch of lies or not, whatever. But Matthew 25 is the picture that we have of what the final judgment will look like. And the judgment is apparently based on whether or not you did feed the hungry or clothe the naked or, visit sick and imprisoned people, those kinds of things. And so I think for me, that is the primary motivation for what drove me into things like socialist politics, because, it's one thing to give a homeless person money, which is very good. I mean, you should do it 100%. But it's another thing to ask, why is housing not a right in, my city, in Toronto, right? And those kinds of questions, I think, are more troubling and also more important to be asking, right? Surely Jesus would rather that everybody was guaranteed a house rather than trying to get everybody to make sure that homeless people, I don't know, have a hamburger that day or whatever. I mean, buy them a hamburger, right? And I'm not saying don't do that, but also fight for their own housing rights. So I think that sort of Christian vision, even that eschatological vision, that judgment vision, is something that's driving my life now, right? The pandemic, I think, too, is such a dramatic expression of all of that, right? It really reveals in a kind of apocalyptic way all these inequalities that exist in society more and more heavily, right? So who's more likely to be sick with COVID or die of COVID? It's people who are poor, it's racialized communities, right? These are the historical kinds of injustices that get revealed when there's a big crisis. I mean, they're revealed already for people paying attention, but they become more and more obvious as time goes on. So in that sense, I think the work feels even more urgent now than it did even before the pandemic, which is absurd because it was already quite urgent back then, right? So yeah, when I think about preparing for Christmas, but also preparing for the second coming, I'm kind of, trying to live a life where I can confidently sort of show up to that moment and have Jesus say, aha, I remembered when you were advocating for the people that I showed up as. I think that's really important.
Matt, did you have any more? I know you said you had some more to say. I want to give you a chance in case.
No, Dean did a good job. Whenever you put it that way, though, it just sounds really scary that Jesus is going to show up and did you do this thing? I get it, but it's scary.
Yes, talking about the idea of the end times has me feeling all sorts of feelings, and as a ex-evangelical in this strange year, I don't know what I would be thinking if I was still in my evangelical world right now. I'd probably be worried the vaccine was the mark of the beast, but that is a discussion for a different day. But speaking of the Bible, speaking of how, faith has kind of actually motivated you a little bit with this theme of thinking and reading critically. Part of the reason that I put reading critically was something like, reading the news critically, thinking about, not just taking a police report at face value when there's an incident of police brutality, but also that same criticalness. If I learned one thing in seminary, maybe I learned one thing. But if I learned one thing in seminary, it was that, we should also look at our sacred text critically. So how has all this other work, how has the Magnificast, the guests that you've talked to, how has that kind of shaped the way that you read, well, really any sacred text, but probably in your case specifically, the Christian scriptures?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think that there's such a fascinating like subset of Marxist interpretation of the Bible that's actually really interesting, and the podcast has maybe opened that up for us in some ways that I maybe wouldn't have found an excuse to go down that road otherwise, and that's been really interesting. So there's loads of stuff like that, right? People doing all kinds of class analyses of the biblical text and what's the real history behind this or that story, all that kind of stuff. So, and I have a lot of time for it, but I have to admit, I'm not like my mind is not a biblical scholar's mind, right? Like I'm not very good at ancient languages. It's really hard for me to keep like dates in my brain in the ancient world or whatever. So what really has driven me, I think, in terms of rediscovering the meaning of the text is looking at how, especially people like liberation theologians or Christians in poor parts of the world have reinterpreted the text for their own situations. So trying to imagine themselves, without worrying about getting things right or wrong, just imagining themselves into that situation, the biblical story, and seeing what that means. There's this book that we read on the podcast called The Gospel in Solentiname, which is a record of conversations between a priest, Ernesto Cardenal, and some other priests, and also a group of peasants in a poor part of Nicaragua living under dictatorship. And the transcription is essentially just all of these characters, these real people reading the Bible, reading these texts, and then wondering, how does this apply? What's it like to read this text 2,000 years ago here in this part of Nicaragua, living in this political situation? And they activate all these themes. They find the revolutionary potential that's there in the text, and they sort of fan those flames. And I think in terms of reading the Bible critically, I guess more I've learned to sort of read it, with a liberating horizon or a revolutionary horizon. And that's been really freeing for myself too, right? To sort of feel emboldened by the text rather than like scared of it or needing to get it exactly right or exactly wrong.
Yeah, I think I have a kind of similar answer. I think mine is maybe a little simpler. Dean knows a little more about theology than I do, but I guess what I do know about the Bible and like reading sort of like ancient religious texts is that they're not one book. They're a bunch of books kind of compiled over time by people. That's true, and because of that, what you end up with is a book that has like that contains so many themes and so many different like voices and genres that like you have to find ways to kind of make sense of it all and like read it all, right? And the Bible especially, I mean, it has things that contradict itself within it. That's like that's Bible study 101. The Bible is complicated like that. So I mean, what you do is you have to find like a hermeneutic guide. Like you have to find something that helps you read the rest of it, or like you have to find something that helps you I don't know, like understand like what the most important thing in the Bible is, right? And just like Dean said, yeah, like finding people who have read the Bible as sort of with a liberatory horizon, or is maybe like the hermeneutic that I think I've started developing. I mean, on this podcast, but also just sort of doing like activist work and doing work in the labor movement. In the gospel, Jesus says that you got to love God and you have to love your neighbor, and I think that's actually a pretty good hermeneutic to start from, rather than like personal salvation or like personal holiness or something. I think like that might be the place I begin from now, rather than like my more evangelical days. So yeah, I mean, just I think that when we do politics, when we kind of learn to see Jesus in these different places, we learn to see God in these different places. Like our priorities shift, and we end up reading our texts in radically different ways.
I think part of the journey is also just, admitting that like it's okay to bring a lens to the text, especially as former evangelicals, where we, the idea was very much this: just read the Bible with Jesus inspiring you, and that was it. Like that was your guidance on how you were supposed to read the Bible. So just, it's already a good start to just begin with knowing and acknowledging, like, hey, I'm coming with a lens. How is that informing me? And as you guys were talking, I couldn't help but think of the I think it's Brecht's poem, "The Worker Reads History," the one about where he says, Alexander the Great did this, but didn't he have a cook, et cetera, et cetera. and it makes me think about the same thing with the scriptures. I know like a lot of feminist theologians have done that for like, where are the women that aren't mentioned in the scriptures? But it's the same thing, where are the people that are doing all the work that make these things possible? So I think, that's, another way that you can kind of approach in a slightly more critical way, looking for who's not mentioned.
Yeah, I think it's really helpful to bring up the idea of like, you're reading the Bible or even just understanding your religious tradition through a particular lens. Like that's a really good point. And I think that, I mean, at least in like sort of progressive strands of Christianity, sometimes the tendency is for people just to be like, well, look, Jesus says all of these things, and that means that Christianity is radical, and we're gonna that's just like what it means, right? It means being progressive liberals or something. And I mean, I think it's worth noting that that is a lens that people are bringing to the Bible, that they're bringing to church history, and I think that's fine that they're doing it. But just recognize that you're doing that, and Dean and I do the same thing, but we're bringing a sort of different lens to it, right? When we say that Jesus says that you have to love God and you have to love your neighbor. I mean, like the way that we interpret that and what the political ramifications are for it, I think are a lot different than someone who would just be like, "Whoa, we need to pass more laws to reform capitalism or something," right? so bringing that lens to it and acknowledging the way that your politics and your prior commitments that you might have outside of your religion, like that really influences the way that you understand your religion, I think that's a good thing. I mean, it's not something to shy away.
Well, as you mentioned there with the reforming capitalism, it actually made me think, maybe this one's specifically targeted for Dean with the slightly more Catholic background, but I believe I saw an article this week about that the Pope was like forming a council with a bunch of very, very, very rich folks about how to fix capitalism. So you have any feelings about that, Dean, if you've read this news article?
I have. Actually, Matt and I were just talking about it recently. Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts about it. I'll say two things. The first thing I'll say is it's not actually clear to me what this story is about. So it's the Council for Inclusive Capitalism. For people who don't know, it's apparently this initiative that the Vatican is invested in. So the news reporting goes that also involves all kinds of CEOs of, oil and gas and all the villains of the world, you might say. I might say. Yeah, I mean, this grabbed a lot of headlines. I'll say by way of sort of hesitation that I'm not convinced that it is as official or as big of a deal as, NBC is making it out to be, let's say. It doesn't appear on like the Vatican website, for instance, right? So how much of this is kind of like a one-sided branding PR grift, and how much of it is real? I don't know. I mean, maybe it's real and that's fine. And that, as far as I'm concerned, that would be bad. But anyway, all that to say, who knows? But it clearly reflects anyway, though, the fact that it's not a scandal, right? The fact that it can be published in NBC News without causing a big stir is perhaps news enough. And I think what it suggests to me is there is this kind of belief that, everything that we live in right now, all the systems we live with are essentially fine, right? Deep down, they're all fine or even good. It's just a matter of kind of getting everything moving in the right direction or getting some bad actors out of power, and it'll all just sort itself out. I think that what Christianity encourages me to do is be suspicious of those kinds of stories. One kind of theological tool that we use is the language of something like idolatry, let's say, right? Which is the simplest thing is sort of the worship of a false deity or something like that. But there's a more complicated way of looking at it, which is to say an idol is that which kind of holds your attention and stops you from imagining life in any other way. It's this thing that kind of grabs a hold of your consciousness and doesn't let you see any other possibility. And I think something like capitalism is that idol of our time. It captures our imagination in a way that makes it hard for us to think of something different, something else. And Christianity, for me, is a way of sort of breaking through that veil and thinking differently. So an inclusive capitalism, I think, is reflective of our faith in that idol, right? That all we have to do is sort of fix it or put better faith in it, and it will sort itself out. But I think that's just simply not, probably not the case. My own analysis suggests.
Well, as somebody who spent a little time in the Catholic Church, I will I find great sympathy with the news often likes to run with the story. So I do understand that. Turning a little bit back to the Bible, the sacred text part of this, do you think, so we talked about it a little on the podcast with like the name, the Magnificast, and had that being based on the Magnificat. Do you think that the Bible has like this urging towards a more radical changing of the world?
It's a good question. I mean, it doesn't, it doesn't. That's what I'll say. That's the short of it. Like, there is a radical pulse that is like no doubt beating in the scriptures, right? Like one way that I got out of evangelicalism, like we were saying earlier, was just by reading the Bible and trying to pay attention to it. And I do believe that. Like, you know, the Bible is very suspicious of state power from the very beginning, like all the way back to when Israel's trying to get a king. God says, you actually do not want one. And then the rest of the story of Israel having a king is not typically, you know, not really a good story. It mostly goes badly. And of course, Jesus Christ is killed by the state, right? So there's this kind of radical pulse. You mentioned the Magnificat, right? Mary's song that the rich will be sent away empty and the poor will be filled. You know, the mighty will be laid low and the lowly will be raised up, right? There's this kind of inversion of the situation of injustice. I think that's present in the Bible. But I think the Bible, like Matt was saying, is also just full of all kinds of stuff. So you have to attend to the complications in it and not just pretend it's all good at the bottom or something.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, just like I was saying, I guess a minute ago, right? The Bible is not reading the Bible and like looking for politics is not the same as reading the Bible and then or is like reading John Locke or something, right? It's a sort of different type of thing that you're looking at. It's not like straightforward political philosophy that's giving you a program about how to change the world and like 10 easy steps or whatever. But I think like what Dino was saying is there's a radical pulse I think you can locate within the biblical text, but like what exactly that means for the current political situation is like always up for negotiation. You know, nowhere Jesus says, you know, to love your neighbor and to make sure the last are first and all these kinds of things that are like interesting and radical in spirit, but like what could you possibly, how would you implement that as like sort of political policy or something, right? And that is, I think, a more interesting part of all of this, because it really takes, I think, a committed community of people to really figure that out. You know, does it mean that we're going to work at the level of state and local politics to pass a constitutional amendment to raise the minimum wage? Does it mean that we're going to start an advocacy group to start like a commune in our backyard and raise our own chickens or something, right? I don't know. I mean, it could mean both of those things depending on sort of like the interpretive project that you and your community are picking up. And I think that's like kind of the interesting thing about the Bible, right? It's telling us what our priorities should be. You know, they should be the poor, they should be the folks that are marginalized and forgotten. Those are our priorities, but it doesn't really tell us how to deal with those priorities, or maybe like what steps to take next. And it's complicated, but I think it's a conversation to have.
Yeah, maybe just one more piece to add on to that. As you were saying that, it made me think of there's a book called Fidel and Religion, which is a recorded conversation between Fidel Castro and a Brazilian priest named Fray Beto. It's a fascinating book for a lot of reasons. But one thing in it that I always recall is they're having this conversation about Christianity and communism, and are they the same? Are they different? Whatever it might be. And Fray Beto is kind of like throwing Fidel Castro a bone at one point, saying, you know, yeah, well, you here in Cuba, like you're building this beautiful, amazing thing, and I wish that more Christians could kind of get on board. And with you know, trying to build a society differently. And Fidel has this very funny response where he says, well, here in Cuba, we are trying to sort of make sure that we can get everybody working according to their ability. But because of our economic position, we're not able to distribute everything according to their need. And he says in the Bible, it's from each according to their ability to each according to their need. And he says the biblical vision is actually more radical than what we've been able to accomplish so far. in Cuban society. So there is this kind of holding open of like a revolutionary space in the biblical text that I think sort of draws us forward, right? It gives us those priorities, as Matt was saying. It gives us maybe some coordinates or some aspirational things that we're always sort of striving toward. And I think that's a real strength, right? You can't just pin it down into a political program. It's always sort of unsettling where you think you're at.
I'm always a big fan of James as well. It's got some good messages about the rich being guilty of exploiting people in there. It's a kind of often forgotten one, because especially as like young evangelicals, you know, the only thing that people talk about with James is like something about like works and faith. So it's kind of generally ignored. But if anything, it reminds me of, you know, I think as someone who is a more progressive person of faith, like I think I often, you know, point and say like, oh, those evangelicals cherry picking verses to try and justify their things. But it's really a tendency of any religious tradition to want to not take it as a whole, but just pick, you know, pick the verse that sounds good to you and then ignore everything else. So it is always important to look at this whole picture. So turning to like the work of the podcast itself, and, you know, how has this work, interacting with so many different people, getting to hear all these different points of view, how has that shaped the way that you think and act with regards to like current events, especially, but I mean in general too?
I think something cool about the podcast is that we end up talking to sometimes a lot of academics, and those are fun and fine episodes, but they're not usually the most impactful on me. But I think in the podcast we end up talking to folks who are usually like older than us and who have some different life experience, and that's always been, I think, my favorite part, and the part that's been the most important. So, for example, yesterday we recorded an episode with one of a big friend of the podcast. His name is Jim Hodgson, and we've had him on a handful of times. Whenever we talk about politics in Latin America, like sort of current events of Latin America, we always have him on because he has this incredibly like storied life of you know, moving around Latin America and like working in journalism and working in communications. And he was like an election observer in Venezuela, and he's been, you know, everywhere, and he knows everybody. And talking to Jim is so cool because I mean, he has all kinds of experience that we don't. He has a whole career and life built up around, like, I think, thinking of similar ideas to us, but just like way more experience. And I think that's been really helpful. But I think what Jim has really taught me, and like people like Jim, is just taught me how to like I don't know, map Christianity onto our understanding of current events. Jim particularly is really good at helping us think about anti-imperialism as a type of Christian practice, of thinking about the current events in Latin America and the ways that the United States has, I mean, you know, backed many coups, but also, I mean, just sanctions countries to hell for sure and destroys their people. And Jim's experience and his sort of knowledge of the entire continent and the region has really, like, I think, helped us understand like what anti-imperialism means for just people on the left in general, but also why it's like important for Christians to understand that, that, you know, if we are really going to be people who like love our neighbors, or, you know, people who don't want to participate in the wanton oppression of other people, then like being an anti-imperialist seems like the most important thing. And anyways, that guest particular has helped me like learn, I think, more about what that means and what it looks like. So yeah, I mean, I think the show teaches me everything. I don't know, it's been really a big educational experience just to learn from other people and to talk to them.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's just because we did just speak with Jim, but he's also at the front of my mind too. I mean, we spoke with him last month as well because of the election in Bolivia. So just been learning quite a lot from him lately in particular. But, you know, just to maybe continue bragging about how great Jim Hodgson is, but also as a good illustrative point, you know, he, so his most recent job was working for the United Church of Canada, which is the biggest Protestant church in the country. And his job was to maintain relationships and partnerships with Christians and other organizations across Latin America and the Caribbean. So he would go to whatever, Colombia, let's say, and they have all kinds of Christian partners, and he meets with them and he talks with them about what they're seeing and needing and thinking about and praying about, etc., and then brings that conversational knowledge back to Canada so that Canadian Christians can have a sort of independent and informed opinion about things. And this may or may not be surprising, I guess, but Christians in Colombia don't think the same way that the politicians in Ottawa in Canada think, right? So it gives you a very different perspective on what's happening and what are the consequences of our government's actions and our own complicity in those actions, et cetera. How could we sort of advocate for change? I was just thinking recently, we talked with him for this episode about elections that happened in Venezuela just this past week. And of course, that's a very controversial thing in the news. And Venezuela is always a controversial country in the news. And what I appreciate about Jim is when we talk to him, we're really getting a perspective of somebody who's thinking from the perspective of, well, I've met all these Christians in Venezuela and here's what they think about what's happening in their complicated country, right? And that's a sort of perspective that always sort of seems to challenge the assumptions that I have, not just the ones I get from watching the CBC or whatever, listening to NPR or something, but also just the assumptions I make as maybe a person on the left and a progressive person. So I think trying to understand what it means to be a Christian in solidarity with the poor, seeing the poor as agents of change, not just as, passive people waiting for handouts or whatever, but seeing the poor as having their own projects and being like, I'm going to link up with that, make sure that I'm defending that, understanding that, et cetera. That has been such a rewarding way to understand a Christian vocation, at least for me.
Beautifully put. So switching gears a little bit, on like a personal level, what are some of the things that really keep you going in challenging times? I mean, 2020 has been a heck of a year, as you and I were talking about letting everybody in. For me, it's felt like a little bit of a dream at points, and it's just been a little surreal at times. So what are the things that really keep you going and motivate you on a personal level?
It's so hard to even think about it. I don't know. I feel like this whole pandemic situation has been completely draining on my life, and it's always just going. I don't know. Hard to think about what keeps me going. I do it. I'm just completely operating off of spite, maybe. I don't know. I'm so mad at all of the dumb things in the world that I'm just motivated to keep going every single day, just being angry about it.
Yeah, I hear that. And I'm definitely sympathetic with that as well, Matt. But I think, one thing that does keep me going is like doing something like this podcast. Like I talk to Matt maybe once or twice a week. And that is such a massive, important thing for my mental health. Just being able to talk to somebody else who kind of understands that the world is, really messed up, and there are people out there trying to do stuff about it. And it's like, all right, we're going to go dig around and see what we can find and who's talking about what. And we'll see if we can get a little bit more understanding of this or that thing that's going on in this crazy world that we're living through, right? I think I'm also really encouraged by, seeing the response to the pandemic that has happened from countries that have much less in terms of economic wealth, but much more in terms of social solidarity. I'm so impressed by, for example, how a country like Cuba has handled the COVID crisis. And not only have they been able to sort of contain the virus with, under incredible international sanctions, which is a wild feat in itself. But, they've been sending doctors to Europe, right, to try to help them figure out how to deal with COVID and things. So yeah, I think it's just, it's in some ways, it's frustrating because here I live in Canada, one of the richest countries on the planet, and we can't seem to figure it out. Meanwhile, Cuba, with less than a fraction of what we have, is figuring it out quite readily. But it's also this incredible testimony to the fact that maybe we could do something different, right? It doesn't have to be the way that it is now. And in fact, in certain parts of the world, it's not like that. So that's really encouraging to me as well. In a day-to-day, what keeps you going? It's knowing that actually some people are pulling it off that really lifts my spirits, I think.
I can definitely say the same there, as somebody who spent the first chunk of the pandemic living in Vietnam, where they've managed to control. I think they're on like their fifth wave that they've managed to deal with every single one that's come in, no matter what. So it really is inspiring to like know that people around the world really are doing things differently and not just accepting that things have to be this way. And hopefully I think that will motivate people in the long run. So I'm going to move into some questions about the podcast. Before I do that, since the Facebook is going to end when we go to the public questioning, if you are watching on Facebook and have a question for Matt and Dean, go ahead and post it in the comments, and I'm going to check that before I close the Facebook Live. So in the meanwhile, though, I want to hear from you guys who, and you can't do the previously mentioned people, who is your favorite guest on the podcast, and maybe a favorite episode that you've done?
Yeah, for sure. There's a lot of them I think that really just like stick in my brain for a long time, that I think I end up really loving. Just a minute ago, I was disparaging academics and how their episodes weren't always my most favorite, but we did talk with a political theologian from the UK named Marika Rose, who wrote a book called Theology of Failure, and that's her book, and the episode that we've done with her, I think we've done two actually, has really stuck with me. It was a really interesting episode about the ways that like Christians really want to escape the like the damage they've done historically. They want to escape, like, you know, they want to you know, wash their hands of all of the bad stuff in Christianity. And her book is really powerful because it's just a big philosophical treatise on why, you know, you can't do that, you know, and she offers sort of a different way around the you know, of thinking about Christian history, and that book has really stuck with me, and the episode's really stuck with me. Another one though that I think has really taught me a lot is that we did a podcast not too long ago with these two pastors who live in Louisiana. The one's named David Brazil and the other is Sarah Pritchard. So they're pastors. They have like a sort of church plant in Louisiana, and they're really interesting people. But they also run this organization called Abolition Apostles. You know, Dean's talking about Christian vocation, and theirs is entirely oriented around prison abolition. And basically what they do is, I mean, they're an advocacy kind of organization, but they have like a letter writing program. They're always writing letters to prisoners. I think, I mean, their whole project is really cool. I think I love that part of it. But also David and Sarah are both like, they're both like really true pastors in like the sort of like, I mean, think in your mind's eye of the Platonic form of pastor, and they are both it. They have this sort of like way of speaking where they're like really, you know, everything they say is rhetorically powerful, soaked in the Bible, and they're just like real true like believers in like what they're talking about, and their authenticity and like I think the power of like what they're doing is really great. So Abolition Apostles is the episode that stuck with me.
Yeah, it's hard to choose. We've had so many really great guests on in the past. Also, we've been fortunate enough to become friends with a lot of those guests and invite our friends onto the show as guests. So it's so difficult to find a favorite. But yeah, I mean, Marika has always stuck out with me too. She literally did change the way that I think about my own relationship to Christianity, right? So that's really powerful, and I'm grateful for that gift. As complicating and frustrating as it might make my spiritual life sometimes. Another too is Amoria Armstrong, who also did the music for our podcast. We've had her on a few times as well, and just an incredibly creative, gifted theologian. She is, I don't know, like able to think about Christianity and the Christian tradition in a really critical way. Like you were talking earlier about trying to read text critically. Amoria has an eye for reading not only the biblical text critically, which she does, but also the tradition of Christianity very critically in a way that is trying to attend to white Christian racism in particular, and how white Christianity sort of puts the world together in ways that are anti-Black and oppressive, and again, just like something that has really changed the way that I perceive my own faith tradition and my participation in it, and has made me more vigilant, I think, or I hope at least, about trying to figure out where I'm reproducing those kinds of patterns and how I can maybe sabotage that programming in my brain or something. So yeah, Amoria Armstrong, just a really really gifted thinker and a fun person to talk to as well, which is always a bonus. Not just a boring flat academic, but like a genuinely nice person. That's the best thing to discover in a guest.
Okay, so I am once again posting in the chat box the links to both the podcast that we recorded together as well as to your website. But besides the website, where can folks find you both online, both as the podcast and as individuals, and maybe other work that you're doing? This is your moment for some self-promotion, and I'm going to swing over and also check the Facebook to see if we have any questions on there.
Yeah, I think that we're most visibly online on Twitter. So you can find our podcast at the Magnificast on Twitter. We do have a Facebook group called the Magnificast Basement, but it's sort of underutilized, I think. Let's see. On Twitter, I am at Matt_Bernico. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of where I think most of any other work I have goes. Let's see. Oh, I should also mention too, I do another podcast too through People's World, which is a newspaper called Beyond the Page. We did an episode this past week with Reverend Liz Theo-Harris from the Poor People's Campaign. So if that's something of interest, you can go check that out too. I retweet it quite constantly. So just find me on Twitter.
Yeah, Twitter is definitely the best place, I guess, to find our up-to-the-minute hottest takes about what's going on in the world. But that stuff is certainly far less interesting than the more produced things that we're doing. You know, you can subscribe to the podcast all over the place, but I have a website that's just deandettloff.com where a lot of my journalism and writing is collected as well. I write as the Canada correspondent for a Jesuit magazine called America Magazine. They're really fantastic folks there, and I'm grateful for the work that they've given me and also the voice and platform that I have there. So you can definitely check them out. Also, Matt and I both work with this magazine called Geez Magazine, Geez, and I would really encourage people to check that out for sure. They're really small. They don't run any ads. They're purely subscription based. It comes out quarterly. The subscription is extremely cheap, and they're doing some of the most interesting stuff, I think, in terms of spirituality and sort of political activism and the arts. So it comes from kind of a, certainly a Christian root, but it's very open to lots of other spiritual communities as well. And they've made a concerted effort to try to make sure that they're incorporating all kinds of voices. So anyway, just a really underknown, but we're big G's champions, and encourage people to check them out if you want to get something really great in your mailbox 4 times a year.
Well, geez. So we do have one question, and I will go back and see if there is more. I'm going to post it in the chat box so everybody can see it. What role, if any, do you think that churches can play in tenant organizing, especially during the pandemic?
Man, I think churches should play a big role in tenant organizing. So I live in Missouri, and there's a few different tenant organizations that are kind of close to me. One of the most, I think, outspoken and probably militant tenant organizations is called Stand Up KC. I think yeah, Kansas City Tenants. It's a union of people in Kansas City who are trying to resist evictions by any means possible. You know, they've gone on their way to to disrupt eviction hearings, to blockade doors, to put their bodies in the way of police. And I think that's been really powerful. What's been cool though is that there have been some clergy who have gotten behind that as well. And I think that there's something really powerful, I think, just about clergy showing up to protests, to events, to strikes. I think that's a really powerful thing. It gives some moral weight to what's happening. It should be obvious, right? There should be the moral weight of evicting people from their homes in the middle of a pandemic in winter should be obvious, but apparently it's not. So if a person who's associated with a moral authority can be there, I think it's really great. And the more lay people there, the better as well. So I don't know. If there are pastors listening, please do this. It's so good. It's so important.
Yeah, one thing that I think is often overlooked is that there are lots of churches who show up, or lots of Christians at least, that show up to any kind of demo or organization that's going on, as long as people sort of know where to look. But I think that's sort of one of the big problems too, is we often don't know where to look, and also there aren't enough churches showing up in such a way that makes it totally undeniable, right? So just like Matt, like here in Toronto, there are some incredible anti-eviction activists, and also anti-homelessness, like people advocating for affordable and public housing and things like that. And among them are especially like street pastors and things like that. And they're on like the forefront of all that kind of stuff. So I just want to make that clear, I guess, that there are actually lots of churches and Christians out there doing it already. But yes, there should be way more. And what role can churches play? I think, two things always come to mind to me. What are churches and Christian ones especially good at? One is cultivating a certain moral language, a certain, pricking of conscience in public. Like that's what churches do all the time. So, and it's what pastors are often trained to do. So if you think that it's bad to throw people out of their houses in the middle of winter when everyone's getting sick, then, churches should have a role to play there and should take that up. The second thing churches are good at doing, though, is getting a lot of people to do a lot of stuff, right? Just amassing people in a specific place, right? Here we are on Zoom even with a bunch of people talking to each other, and that's so fantastic. I think it's the same with these kinds of activities, right? Evictions, a lot of times all you need to do to stop an eviction, all you need to do makes it sound simple, but really, all you need to do is get a lot of people in one place who just refuse to let an eviction take place, right? It's not that simple, but that's what it takes. It takes a lot of people. And I think church congregations are already a lot of people. So if you could just take all those people on a Sunday and put them somewhere else on a Tuesday, you'd be in good shape.
That's true. Churches are so good at mobilizing people to do incredibly boring things. So imagine if they asked you to do something exciting.
Shout out to our own Fourth Universalist, which has worked both as a sanctuary church and in this election, actually, gosh, it was a couple 100,000 postcards they sent out. So yeah, definitely, even in the midst of a pandemic, you can find ways to get people organized. I'm going to do one last quick look to see if there's any additional questions. I do not see any. So Facebookers, we are going to leave the Facebookers. Everybody else can stay on. We just want to make sure that people don't have their questions from the Zoom broadcasted to the public. So we are going to go ahead and close down our live stream. If you do have a question,